The desert wind carried secrets across the flat expanse of Arizona rangeland on that spring morning in 2000. In a small town where neighbors knew each other's routines and children played freely in dusty yards, a family would be shattered by an act so incomprehensible that even decades later, those who lived through it speak of it in hushed tones. The sun rose over the modest trailer home on the outskirts of town, casting long shadows across the gravel driveway where a pickup truck sat silent. Inside, a mother prepared breakfast while her children stirred in their beds. By nightfall, one of those children would be gone. The question that would haunt investigators for 24 years was not what happened, but who could have done such a thing. And when the answer finally came, it would tear apart everything this community thought they understood about evil hiding in plain sight. The town itself seemed frozen in time, a collection of scattered homes and ranch properties connected by long stretches of two-lane highway. Population barely cresting 1,500 souls, the kind of place where the school served kindergarten through 12th grade in a single building, where the post office doubled as the social hub, and where everyone claimed to know everyone else. The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, sagebrush and creosote bush interrupted only by the occasional mesquite tree, the mountains rising purple and distant on the horizon. Summer temperatures routinely exceeded 110 degrees. Spring brought dust storms that turned the sky orange and coated everything in fine grit. Winter nights dropped below freezing. It was harsh country that bred hardy people, or so they told themselves. The family lived in a single-wide trailer set back from the road, accessible by a quarter-mile dirt track that kicked up plumes of dust whenever a vehicle passed. The mother, 32 years old, worked part-time at the convenience store in town. She had 3 children, a daughter aged 8, a son aged 6, and another daughter just turned 4. The children's father had never been in the picture. A boyfriend had moved in 6 months earlier, a 38-year-old man who worked intermittently in construction and spent his evenings watching television while drinking beer from cans. He crushed and tossed into a growing pile beside the porch steps. Neighbors who drove past sometimes saw him working on his truck, sometimes saw him sitting motionless in a lawn chair, staring at nothing. April 14th began like any other day in that household. The alarm clock buzzed at 6:30. The mother rose first, moving through the narrow hallway past the children's bedroom where all 3 slept in bunk beds and a toddler mattress on the floor. She started coffee in the small kitchen where the linoleum was cracked and the cabinets hung slightly crooked. Outside, a rooster crowed from a neighboring property. The boyfriend emerged around 7, showered, dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt despite the warming weather. He said he had a job lined up, some fencing work at a ranch 40 miles north. He would be gone most of the day. The mother nodded, reminded him to take water, turned her attention to waking the children. The 8-year-old daughter helped her younger siblings dress. The 6-year-old boy complained about his cereal, wanted pancakes instead, was told there wasn't time. The 4-year-old, small for her age with light brown hair that her mother kept in pigtails, clutched a stuffed rabbit she had slept with since infancy. She was quiet by nature, more likely to observe than participate, content to play alone while her older siblings roughhoused. Those who knew her described a child who startled easily, who sometimes flinched at loud noises, who preferred to stay close to her mother when strangers were present. The boyfriend left the trailer at 7:45. The mother heard his truck engine start, heard the gravel crunch under tires, watched through the window as he drove away. The older 2 children caught the school bus at 8:15 from the end of their access road. The mother walked them down, holding the 4-year-old's hand, waiting until the yellow bus appeared and carried her older children away. Then she returned to the trailer with her youngest daughter. She had a shift starting at 10. A neighbor, an older woman who occasionally babysat, was supposed to arrive at 9:30. The morning passed slowly. The mother tidied the small living space, folded laundry, let her daughter watch cartoons on the television. The neighbor arrived precisely at 9:30, knocked once before entering as was her custom. The two women spoke briefly. The 4-year-old remained on the couch, eyes fixed on the screen, the stuffed rabbit in her lap. The mother kissed her daughter's forehead, told her to be good, promised to bring home ice cream after work. She left at 9:45. At the convenience store, she rang up purchases, restocked shelves, chatted with customers about the weather and local gossip. Her shift was uneventful. She thought about her children periodically, the way mothers do, but felt no particular concern. The older two were in school. The youngest was with a trusted babysitter. Her boyfriend would return from his fencing job sometime in the evening. Everything was as it should be. The neighbor later described a quiet morning with the child. They colored pictures together, they ate crackers and drank juice. Around 11:30, the neighbor said she stepped outside to water her own plants that she kept in pots on the trailer's porch. She was gone perhaps 5 minutes. When she returned, the 4-year-old was no longer in the living room. The neighbor called her name. No response. She checked the bathroom. Empty. She checked the bedroom. Empty. She stepped outside again, looked around the property, called the child's name louder. The desert wind carried her voice away. The swing set in the yard hung motionless. A plastic toy truck lay on its side in the dirt. Clear's throat. The neighbor's growing panic crystallized into certainty within minutes. She searched every corner of the trailer, looked under beds, inside closets, places too small for a child to actually hide, but where desperate hope insisted she must look anyway. She ran outside again, circled the property, screaming the girl's name until her throat went raw. At 11:53, she called emergency services. Her voice on the recording trembled so badly, the dispatcher had to ask her twice to repeat the address. The first deputy arrived at 12:07. He found the neighbor sitting on the porch steps, crying uncontrollably, repeating that she had only been outside for a few minutes, just a few minutes. She never should have left her alone. The deputy radioed for additional units and began a systematic search of the immediate area. More deputies arrived. They fanned out across the desert scrubland, calling the child's name, looking for any sign of disturbance in the sandy soil, any scrap of fabric caught on barbed wire, any indication of which direction she might have wandered. The mother was located at work and informed at 12:35. Witnesses later described the sound she made when told her daughter was missing, a wail of pure animal anguish that caused customers to freeze mid-transaction and stare. She was driven home by a deputy, arrived at 1:15 to find her property transformed into a command center. Vehicles lined the access road. Uniformed personnel moved with purpose between trailer and desert. Search dogs had been brought in, their handlers allowing them to sniff items from the child's room before releasing them to track. The dogs immediately picked up a scent trail leading from the trailer toward the main road, then appearing to circle back, then heading off into the desert in a direction that made no logical sense for a 4-year-old child wandering alone. The handlers noted this oddity but continued following where the dogs led. The trail went cold approximately half a mile from the trailer, in an area of packed caliche soil where tracks would be difficult to detect. The boyfriend returned to the property at 2:27 in the afternoon. Deputies noted the exact time because his arrival felt significant somehow, though they could not immediately articulate why. He parked his truck, emerged, surveyed the scene with what multiple officers later described as unusual calm. When informed that the 4-year-old was missing, he nodded slowly, asked what he could do to help. His demeanor struck the responding deputy as odd enough to note in his incident report. Subject appeared remarkably composed given circumstances. No visible emotional response. Cooperative but detached. The boyfriend stated he had been working at a ranch property 40 miles north, providing the name and contact information for the ranch owner who had hired him. He said he had left that morning around 7:45, driven straight to the ranch, worked on fencing from approximately 8:30 until 1:30, then stopped for lunch at a gas station on the highway before returning home. He had not been in contact with anyone from the household during the day. He had no idea what might have happened to the child. Deputies interviewed him at length while the search continued. He remained calm throughout, answering questions in a measured tone, occasionally pausing as if carefully considering his words. When asked if the 4-year-old had any favorite places she liked to play, he shrugged and said she mostly stayed inside. When asked if she had ever wandered off before, he said not to his knowledge. When asked about his relationship with the child, he said they got along fine. She was quiet, stayed out of his way mostly. Those who knew him said he had always been like that, reserved, hard to read. He did not smile often. He did not engage in small talk. He worked when work was available and kept to himself otherwise. Some described him as helpful in a crisis, the type to show up with tools when something needed fixing. Others found him vaguely unsettling in ways they could not quite name, something about the flatness in his eyes, the way he stared just a bit too long without blinking. As afternoon stretched into evening, the search expanded dramatically. Volunteers from across the county arrived. They formed lines and walked slowly through the desert, eyes scanning the ground for any trace. Helicopters flew overhead in grid patterns. Search and rescue teams rappelled into arroyos and checked abandoned structures. The local news covered the story, broadcasting the child's description and last known clothing: pink shirt, denim shorts, white sneakers with purple laces. The stuffed rabbit she usually carried had been found in the trailer, suggesting she left without it, which her mother said was highly unusual. The mother gave multiple interviews to investigators, her voice breaking, her hands twisting together constantly. She described her daughter as shy but happy, healthy, developing normally. She had no medical conditions. She had never wandered away before. She was afraid of strangers. The idea that she would have voluntarily left with someone seemed impossible. The idea that she would have walked off into the desert alone seemed equally impossible. So where was she? Clear's throat. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about details that did not quite align. The boyfriend's timeline placed him driving to the ranch around 8 in the morning, yet the ranch owner, when contacted, said he had not arrived until closer to 9:30. The boyfriend claimed he had worked steadily until 1:30, but other workers at the ranch recalled him taking a long break mid-morning, saying he needed to run an errand. He had been gone perhaps 90 minutes. When questioned about this discrepancy, he frowned and said he must have been confused about the timing. The days all ran together. Maybe he had gone to get supplies or something. He could not remember exactly. Investigators calculated distances and drive times. From the trailer to the ranch was 43 miles. At highway speeds, approximately 45 minutes one way. If the boyfriend had left at 7:45 as he claimed, he would have arrived at the ranch around 8:30, matching his original statement. But if he had not arrived until 9:30 as the ranch owner stated, then he had been unaccounted for during a critical window. Where was he between 7:45 and 9:30? The boyfriend's truck was examined. The odometer reading was noted and compared against his stated route. The mileage was higher than it should have been by approximately 34 miles. When confronted with this, he said he had driven around that morning before going to the ranch, maybe took a wrong turn. He was not entirely sure. He had not been paying close attention. Deputies asked where exactly he had driven. He said he could not remember, just around, nowhere specific. Investigators requested permission to search the boyfriend's truck more thoroughly. He consented without hesitation, signed the waiver, stood back while they examined the vehicle inside and out. They found nothing immediately incriminating. Work tools in the truck bed, fast food wrappers in the cab, dirt and dust coating every surface. They collected samples of the dirt, soil from the truck bed and floor mats and tires, intending to compare it against soil from various locations to establish where the vehicle had been. The search for the child continued through the night. Floodlights illuminated the desert. Volunteers drank coffee from thermoses and refused to go home. The mother sat in the trailer, surrounded by family and friends who had arrived to support her, staring at the television that was broadcasting news coverage of the search. She looked hollowed out, aged 10 years in 10 hours. The boyfriend sat outside on the porch in his lawn chair, smoking cigarettes, watching the activity with that same unsettling calm. By the second day, the search had covered over 100 square miles. Divers checked stock tanks and irrigation ponds. Ground-penetrating radar was used on suspicious areas of disturbed soil. Cadaver dogs were brought in. The community prayed for a miracle, for the child to be found alive, thirsty and sunburned and frightened, but alive. As hours became days, that hope began to curdle into something darker. The boyfriend was asked to take a voluntary polygraph examination. He agreed. The examination was conducted on April 17th, 3 days after the disappearance. The examiner later reported that the boyfriend showed deception on key questions, particularly when asked if he knew what happened to the child, if he had harmed her, if he knew where she was. When confronted with these results, the boyfriend became the most animated investigators had yet seen him. He insisted the machine was wrong. He had nothing to do with this. He loved those kids. He would never hurt them. The protestations felt rehearsed somehow, delivered with intensity but without genuine emotion behind the words. Investigators interviewed the 2 older children carefully, using specialists trained in speaking with young witnesses. The 8-year-old daughter said the boyfriend was mean sometimes. He yelled when they were too loud. He told them to stay out of his way. She did not like when her mother left her alone with him. When asked if he had ever hurt her or her siblings, she hesitated, then shook her head, but the hesitation was noted. The 6-year-old son was less forthcoming, gave mostly one-word answers, seemed frightened by the questioning itself. Community members began to come forward with observations that had seemed innocuous at the time, but now felt heavy with potential meaning. A neighbor mentioned seeing the boyfriend's truck parked at an unusual angle that morning, backed up to the trailer rather than parked normally. Another person recalled seeing him at a gas station on the outskirts of town around 8:30, which did not match his stated timeline of driving directly to the ranch. A clerk at a hardware store 3 towns over said a man matching his description had purchased a shovel and tarp 2 weeks earlier, paid cash, did not make conversation. The physical evidence remained frustratingly sparse. The soil samples from the boyfriend's truck matched soil found throughout the region, too common to be conclusive. No blood or biological material was detected despite extensive testing. Cadaver dogs showed interest in several locations but nothing definitive. The child's body was not found. Without a body, without a clear crime scene, without eyewitnesses, the case began to stall. The boyfriend continued living at the trailer initially. The mother, torn between suspicion and loyalty, between what investigators were implying and what she wanted to believe, allowed him to stay. Tensions in the household became unbearable. The boyfriend maintained his innocence with increasing anger. The mother oscillated between defending him and doubting him. The 2 older children grew withdrawn and fearful. Relatives urged the mother to make him leave. After 2 weeks, he moved out voluntarily, relocated to a different town, told people who asked that he had been wrongly accused. that the authorities needed a scapegoat and he was convenient. Clears throat. The investigation continued for months with diminishing momentum. Detectives followed leads that went nowhere. Anonymous tips poured in, were investigated, proved baseless. Psychics contacted the department offering visions. Conspiracy theories circulated. The media coverage gradually decreased. The public's attention moved on to newer tragedies. The mother packed up the trailer and moved with her 2 remaining children to another state, seeking distance from the memories and the whispers. The case grew cold. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt the cognitive dissonance of suspecting the person sleeping beside you of something monstrous, the years that followed were a study in psychological torment for everyone connected to this case. The mother rebuilt a life of sorts, though those who knew her said she was never the same. She worked. She raised her children. She maintained the fiction that her youngest daughter had simply vanished, taken by a stranger perhaps, lost in the desert. An inexplicable tragedy, but not one caused by someone she had welcomed into her home and her bed. The 8-year-old daughter grew into a teenager carrying weight that manifested in nightmares and anxiety. She drew pictures sometimes, disturbing images that her school counselor noted with concern. Dark figures looming over small shapes, hands reaching, mouths open in silent screams. When asked about the drawings, she said she did not know why she made them. They just came out that way. The son became withdrawn and angry, acting out in school, getting into fights, accumulating a juvenile record by age 14. The family moved frequently, never quite settling, always seemingly in flight from something unspoken. The boyfriend drifted through a series of relationships and jobs over the years. He was questioned again by investigators in 2003 when a tip suggested he had made comments about the case while drinking. The lead produced nothing actionable. He was interviewed again in 2007 when advances in forensic technology prompted a review of old evidence. Again, nothing conclusive emerged. He married in 2009, divorced in 2012. His ex-wife, when contacted by investigators as part of routine follow-up, said he had never spoken about the case, became hostile when she asked about it, told her it was none of her business what happened before they met. Those who worked the investigation never forgot it. The lead detective kept the case file on his desk even after he transferred to other assignments. He reviewed it periodically, looking for something he might have missed, some connection he failed to make. The detective who conducted the interrogations said in later interviews that he knew, absolutely knew, that the boyfriend was responsible, but knowing and proving were entirely different things. The frustration of that gap haunted him into retirement. The passage of time did strange things to memory and perspective. Some in the community began to question whether the boyfriend had actually been involved at all. Maybe it really was a stranger abduction. Maybe the child did wander off and succumb to the elements. Maybe the investigation had fixated on the wrong person out of desperation for answers. Others remained convinced of his guilt, pointed to the inconsistencies in his timeline, the failed polygraph, the oddness of his demeanor. The truth remained elusive, buried somewhere beneath layers of time and trauma and missing evidence. Then, in the summer of 2023, 23 years after the disappearance, something shifted. The 8-year-old daughter was now 31 years old, married with children of her own. She had spent over 2 decades carrying fragments of memory that she had never fully examined, moments from childhood that she had pushed down because confronting them seemed too difficult. But having her own daughter, watching her play, feeling the fierce protective love that motherhood brings, began to unlock something. She started having vivid dreams about the day her sister disappeared. Dreams that felt less like imagination and more like recovered memory. She contacted the sheriff's department that had investigated the case. She was connected with a cold case detective who had recently begun reviewing unsolved cases from the late 1990s and early 2000s. The detective listened as she spoke haltingly about memories that were surfacing, memories she was not entirely certain were real or reliable, but that felt important somehow. She remembered the morning differently than she had told police as a child. She remembered waking up earlier than usual, before her mother's alarm, hearing voices in the living room. The boyfriend and her mother talking in tones too low to make out words. She remembered getting up, standing in the hallway, watching through the gap in the door. She remembered seeing the boyfriend pick up her 4-year-old sister, remembered her sister still in pajamas, remembered thinking it was strange because he never paid attention to her sister normally, never carried her or showed her affection. The detective asked gentle questions. Was it possible this memory was from a different day? The woman said she did not think so. She remembered the feeling of wrongness, the sense that something was not right. She remembered going back to bed, hearing the front door open and close, hearing the truck engine start. She remembered her mother waking them later for school, acting normal, and deciding not to mention what she had seen because she did not know what it meant. Clears throat. For those who have ever wondered whether childhood memories can be trusted decades later, this presented a significant challenge. Memory is notoriously unreliable, subject to suggestion and distortion, particularly memories formed at young ages and recalled many years later. But the detective took the statement seriously, added it to the case file, began pulling threads to see what unraveled. He contacted the mother, who still lived out of state. She was shocked to hear from investigators after so many years. When told about her daughter's recovered memories, she fell silent for a long time. Then she began to speak about things she had never told anyone, secrets she had kept because acknowledging them felt like admitting her own culpability in her daughter's disappearance. She said the boyfriend had been different in the weeks before the incident, quieter than usual, more tense. She had found him awake multiple times in the middle of the night, sitting in the dark living room staring at nothing. Once she had caught him standing in the doorway of the children's room, just standing there watching them sleep. When she asked what he was doing, he said he heard a noise, was checking on them. She had not thought much of it at the time. Looking back through the lens of suspicion, it seemed ominous. She said that in the days after the disappearance, he had been insistent that they not talk to media, that they maintain privacy, that they trust the police to do their job. He had discouraged her from posting flyers or organizing volunteer searches. He said it would not help, would just draw negative attention. She had been too distraught to argue, had deferred to his judgment. Now she wondered if he had been controlling the narrative, limiting exposure that might have generated leads. She said their relationship had deteriorated rapidly after he moved out. He had contacted her a few times, angry phone calls where he accused her of turning everyone against him, of believing lies about him. In one call, she remembered him saying something strange. He had said, "You don't understand what I saved you from. You should be grateful." When she asked what he meant, he hung up. She never heard from him again. The detective tracked the boyfriend's current location. He was living in New Mexico, working as a handyman, living alone in a small rental house on the outskirts of a town even smaller than the one where the crime occurred. The detective contacted local law enforcement and traveled to conduct an interview. The boyfriend, now 62 years old, agreed to speak without an attorney present. He seemed unsurprised by the visit, almost as if he had been expecting it eventually. He looked older, weathered by desert sun and hard living, but his eyes held that same flat quality that investigators had noted decades earlier. When asked about the case, he said he had nothing new to add. He did not know what happened to the child. He had not been involved. He understood that people suspected him, but suspicion was not evidence. The detective presented the new information. The daughters recovered memories about seeing him with the child that morning. The boyfriend's expression did not change. He said memory was unreliable. The daughter had been 8 years old. She was probably confused, mixing up different days. It meant nothing. The detective shifted approaches. He asked about the discrepancies in the original timeline, the mileage on the truck, the conflicting statements about when he arrived at the ranch. The boyfriend sighed and said he had explained all that years ago. He had been confused. He had not been paying attention to times and distances. He was not involved. Then the detective mentioned the soil samples. Forensic science had advanced considerably in 23 years. The samples collected in 2000 had been preserved. Recent reanalysis using new techniques had identified unique mineral compositions that matched soil found in a very specific geographic area, a remote canyon approximately 26 miles from the trailer. Not along the route to the ranch where the boyfriend claimed to have driven that day. Not in any area he had logical reason to visit. The canyon was accessible only by dirt roads that required local knowledge to navigate. A place where someone could dispose of something they wanted never to be found. The boyfriend's composure cracked slightly. He said soil was just soil. It meant nothing. The detective said search teams had never examined that canyon because no one had reason to suspect it. But based on the new analysis, cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar would be deployed there within the week. If there was anything to find, they would find it. The interview concluded without a confession, but the boyfriend's demeanor had shifted from calm to agitated. He insisted again that he had nothing to do with the disappearance. He said he wanted the detective to leave. The detective thanked him for his time and departed. 3 days later, a team of investigators descended on the remote canyon. The terrain was rugged, strewn with boulders and thick with desert vegetation. They worked methodically, dividing the area into sections, using dogs and radar in tandem. On the second day, at approximately 2 in the afternoon, one of the cadaver dogs alerted strongly to a location beneath an overhang of rock, an area where soil appeared to have been disturbed long ago and then left to settle naturally over years. Excavation began carefully. Approximately 18 inches down, they uncovered remnants of a tarp, deteriorated badly but still partially intact. Beneath the tarp, they found small bones. The medical examiner confirmed on site that the remains were consistent with a young child. Dental records would be needed for positive identification, but investigators knew. They had found her. Clears throat. The boyfriend was arrested on June 7, 2024, as he left his rental house to go to work. He did not resist. He did not speak. He was extradited back to Arizona, charged with first-degree homicide and child abuse resulting in death. The media coverage was extensive. The community that had mostly forgotten the case was reminded brutally of the little girl who had vanished 24 years earlier. Vigils were held. The mother released a statement through her attorney, saying she was grateful for the perseverance of investigators and heartbroken that her daughter had suffered such a fate. The trial began in October 2024. Prosecutors laid out their case methodically. The timeline discrepancies, the failed polygraph, the soil evidence linking his truck to the burial site, the daughter's testimony about seeing him with the child that morning. The ex-wife was called to testify about his refusal to discuss the case, his hostile reactions when questioned. Forensic experts explained how new analysis techniques had identified the specific mineral signatures in soil samples. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial. The daughter's memories were unreliable, possibly implanted by suggestion over the years. The soil evidence proved only that his truck had been in that area at some point, not necessarily on the day in question. The prosecution had no physical evidence tying him directly to the child's death. No DNA, no fingerprints, no murder weapon, no eyewitnesses to the actual act. The boyfriend did not testify in his own defense. He sat motionless throughout the proceedings, that same flat affect, watching witnesses speak about him as if they were discussing a stranger. The jury deliberated for 4 days. On November 2, 2024, they returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Sentencing occurred in December. The judge allowed victim impact statements. The mother spoke about 24 years of not knowing, of suspecting but being unable to prove, of guilt over allowing the boyfriend into their home, of grief that had no closure until remains were finally recovered. The older daughter spoke about nightmares and trauma, about growing up knowing her sister was dead but not being able to say for certain, about the relief and horror of confirmation. The son, now 30 years old, spoke briefly about anger and loss, and a childhood stolen by violence. The boyfriend was given an opportunity to address the court. He stood. He looked at the judge, at the family, at the gallery full of people who had waited decades for this moment. He said, "I did not do this, nothing more." He sat back down. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole. As deputies led him away, he glanced once at the mother. She stared back, tears streaming down her face. He looked away first. The case that had haunted a community for nearly a quarter century was finally closed. The little girl who had been 4 years old when she disappeared was finally laid to rest in a ceremony attended by hundreds. Her grave marker bore her name, her dates of birth and death, and a simple epitaph: "Forever loved, never forgotten." Those who had worked the investigation felt a measure of vindication but no satisfaction. Justice delayed is not the same as justice served. The detective who had kept the case file on his desk for decades attended the sentencing, sat in the back row, allowed himself to feel the weight he had carried for so long begin to lift. After the proceedings concluded, he walked outside into the December sunshine and wept. For those who followed the case, who watched it unfold across news cycles and courtroom proceedings, the question remained: why? What possessed someone to harm a defenseless child? The boyfriend never confessed, never explained his motive, never provided the narrative closure that families and communities crave in the aftermath of inexplicable violence. Psychologists speculated about control, about rage, about pathology hidden beneath a veneer of normalcy. But speculation is not understanding. The mother relocated again after the trial, seeking yet another fresh start. Her surviving children struggled with complex emotions: relief that their sister had been found, anger that it took so long, guilt over childhood memories they could not fully trust. Therapy helped. Time helped. Nothing made it better, but slowly it became bearable. The town where it happened has changed little in the years since. The trailer where the family lived has been removed, the lot empty now, overgrown with desert plants. Locals drive past without slowing, without remembering most of the time what occurred there. But some remember. Some will always remember. On certain spring mornings when the wind blows just right, they think of a little girl with pigtails and a stuffed rabbit, playing in the yard while the swing hung still, and the toy truck lay on its side in the dirt. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.